welcome to the Theology Mill podcast brought to you by Wittgenstock Publishers. My name is Zach Mickle. I am the digital marketing manager here at Wittgenstock and the host of this podcast, which consists of interviews with leading authors and thinkers in theology, biblical studies, and philosophy. If you like what you're hearing on our podcast, please also stop by our website at wittgenstock.com, where you can browse our catalog and also check out our blog. You're listening right now to the second episode in our Patočka Booth. The Patočka Booth is a three-part series of interviews on the Czech philosopher and dissident Jan Patočka, who lived from 1907 to 1977. These interviews will explore his philosophical and political thought, his biography and context, and his import for theology. So on this episode, I speak with Dr. David Lloyd Dusenbury. Dr. Dusenbury is a senior fellow at the Danube Institute and a visiting professor at Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest. He's also the author of I Judge No One, A Political Life of Jesus, published by Oxford University Press in 2022, as well as the author of a forthcoming volume on Jan Patočka. So without any further ado, thank you so much for listening, and we really hope you enjoy this conversation. So I am here with Dr. David Lloyd Dusenbury for our Patočka Booth, which is on all things Jan Patočka, the Czech philosopher. David is the author of I Judge No One, A Political Life of Jesus, which came out just last year in 2022. And he's also a commentator on Jan Patočka and his philosophy of history. So as we get started here, David, could you just tell us a bit about yourself, maybe what you do, and also how you came to study Jan Patočka?
Yeah, well, it's such a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on. So I'm dialing in from Budapest, Hungary, which is where I've been for the last 2 years. And I'm a senior fellow at the Danube Institute, which is one of the kind of initiatives or institutes of the Batthyány Lajos Foundation, which is one of the sort of cultural foundations of the Hungarian nation. So I do a number of different things for them, overseeing research and producing research of my own on basically the Christian kind of roots of European legal and political culture. And I'm also a visiting professor at the former University of Budapest, which has now been renamed Eötvös Loránd University. And so I teach history of religion, history of philosophy. And actually this semester I'm teaching volumes 3 and 4 of Michel Foucault's History of Sexuality, which is not totally unrelated to our topic today, because Foucault read some Patočka, and I think Patočka may have influenced the late Foucault, in fact.
Interesting. Okay, and then how did you kind of come to study Jan Patočka himself?
So it's by way of Derrida. Derrida wrote about Patočka in the 1990s, a text which might be familiar, I'm sure, to you and maybe to some of your listeners. So in 95, he wrote The Gift of Death, and which is really, among other things, a sustained meditation on Jan Patočka's Heretical essays, which is one of the main texts I've been working on. And I was first introduced to him by Derrida, and then in the early 2000s, Stanford published a really fine translation of a different text by Jan Patočka called Plato and Europe, which is another text we'll be discussing. And so I read that in the early 2000s and sort of came back to him when I moved to Central Europe.
Got it. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so this is kind of our fun question that we like to start with, which is if you could put 3 other figures, dead or alive, in a room all together, and Jan Patočka is already in there, so he's figured in the round table, and you could kind of listen to their conversation, which figures would you choose and why?
Well, I think the third I've already mentioned. It makes sense to me for a variety of reasons to put Derrida and Patočka across a table, because in a sense Derrida did this himself not so long after Patočka's death. And it's not only possible, but likely they would have met had it not been for the Iron Curtain. So I think that's a very reasonable pair to start off with. And then I suppose, honestly, the two others would be Patočka's primary interlocutors, who were also Derrida's primary interlocutors, which would be Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger. I know both those names will be familiar to your listeners. I see that you've done a lot on phenomenology. Mm-hmm. And so I could say a bit more about why they're interesting, but I think Husserl, Heidegger, and Derrida would make for a really intriguing, subtle and challenging conversation with Patočka.
Sure. Yeah. What would be like some of the maybe specifics of the conversation that you'd be especially interested in hearing?
So the late Patočka really begins to focus on the question of Europe, the idea of Europe, the history of Europe, the spiritual legacy of Europe. And this theme, this preoccupation is not so present in his early work. And quite frankly, it's worth remembering, it was not so obvious in the mid-1970s to be talking about Europe, because of course Europe had been cut in half for several decades, and there was no sign of a reunification in the mid-1970s in the Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia, rather. So this is one of Patočka's late, almost obsessions, you can say, and he advances some radical ideas. He himself calls them quite radical and surprising. And I really think that this stems from his reading of Husserl's great book, The Crisis of European Sciences, in the 1930s. So Husserl was a mentor of Patočka's in the 1930s. Patočka is kind of correctly described as one of Husserl's last students. And in the same period, Patočka was attending lectures given by Martin Heidegger. And Heidegger and Husserl had already become alienated at this point because Heidegger had aligned himself with the National Socialist regime and behaved really abominably towards his mentor Husserl. But nevertheless, Patočka kind of from the beginning situates himself kind of between Husserl and Heidegger. We can discuss that more. But I think with Husserl, The Crisis is really the text which seems to be with Patočka to the very end. And this question of what the essence of Europe is, what the spiritual legacy of Europe is, what sets it off from other great civilizations, and whether it has a future. These are all questions that Husserl had raised and that Patočka continues to pursue.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so who, for our familiars who are maybe not as familiar, who was this man, Jan Patočka? What were maybe some of the major events in his life, whether kind of personal, intellectual, or otherwise?
Well, I mean, I think, honestly, the greatest event in his life was the Second World War and the onset of the Cold War. Because basically, to put it very simply, Jan Patočka was a great academic philosopher. I've already mentioned his connection to Husserl and Heidegger. And he was a devotee of the tradition of phenomenology. And it seems clear that he would have given his life to teaching in a university. But his refusal to sort of collaborate with either the Nazi German regime or the Soviet communist regime meant that with a very few number of years being accepted, he was banned from teaching for his entire mature life. And so he's kind of a professor manqué, I suppose we could say. And the only reason we still know of him, and people like Derrida were able to write about him in the 90s, is because even though he was forbidden to teach in the universities in Prague, he nevertheless participated in a number of kind of clandestine meetings, which are sometimes called the underground university. So private seminars, quite secretive seminars, were held in private homes in Prague in the 1970s. And it's this milieu, this context, which really gives rise to the two texts I've already mentioned, his heretical essays in the philosophy of history, and then Plato and Europe, both of which are circling the same questions, I think, but in somewhat different ways.
Sure.
And I suppose, so I think his exclusion from the university because of his refusal to collaborate, to sign on to either the German regime or the Soviet regime, I think that is really the defining feature of his life. And then what leads to his death is his decision in January 1977 to not only sign a human rights charter, it's called Charter 77, but also to become its spokesman. And this was a charter which tried to publicly hold the Soviet regime in Czechoslovakia to account, not kind of in light of abstract principles or, revolutionary commitments, but rather they were just trying to publicly state that the Czech regime was not honoring the commitments it itself had made in a number of documents and covenants. So this was in January of 77 that he became the spokesman for this movement. And by March, he was dead. So he was very heavily, brutally interrogated by the Czech state police. And one of those interrogations seems to have basically led to his death in March of 77. So he was excluded from the university and then essentially taken out by the state. That seems to rather accurately summarize his life.
Had he experienced any kind of police intervention before? Because I know that the underground seminars you were speaking of were kind of constantly being constantly had moles, police, kind of intervening in them. So had he had any kind of encounters with law enforcement or with the secret police before this interrogation that happened in 1977? Do you know?
I don't know. It's an excellent question, but I have not seen any references so far to previous interrogations or certainly incarcerations. So
sure.
My vague impression is that the final kind of confrontation with the state was at least the decisive and the most prominent one.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Okay, so what are kind of some of the key themes or ideas that run through his corpus of work?
Well, I mean, I think there are several that would be of interest, for us in this conversation. One is really that within a variety of horizons, which we can discuss, Patočka believes that the modern idea of history, not only Marxist, Leninist, but he would argue also kind of Western capitalist, the modern idea of history is both materialistic and in some sense deterministic. So the idea of progress he sees as a kind of deterministic theory of human history, which has a fundamentally kind of materialistic set of presuppositions underlying it. So I think one of the most important things he argues is simply that the soul, the human soul, is at the very center of history, and that history is not, in a sense, a sequence which can have a science. It is rather a sequence of events in which every human soul is a player, and thus the fundamental phenomenon of history is decision. And he even goes further and says the most fundamental decision any human has to make is what he himself calls conversion, metanoia. So I really do think that he advances a kind of radically distinctive philosophy of history when you look at a lot of 19th and 20th century philosophy. So I think this would be one thing. Another would be that the Europe he speaks of in many of his late writings is also a Europe which he believes already in the 1970s has disappeared. So he says very, very forcefully, Europe has disappeared probably forever. And that adds kind of both a depth and an intensity, but also a poignancy to the fact that he makes this claim that Europe has disappeared precisely in the course of lectures titled Plato and Europe. So he was devoting himself to a legacy which he thought was not only in peril, but had actually already vanished. So I think this idea of the end of Europe, he also used the phrase Europe after Europe, is quite distinctive. And really, one could say, I mean, you always have to be careful using this word, but one could say that he was rather prophetic. I think he captures the mood in the 1970s that was certainly not common in the 1970s in Western Europe, but is becoming more common today in Europe, that we really are a civilization in crisis. And then I think the third would be that the Europe which has vanished in large part because it's essentially Christian. And so I think we'll discuss much more of this, but he was very firmly committed to the idea that the spiritual legacy of Europe and the West is inextricably linked to Christianity and to Christianity's sustained engagement with Greek and Roman philosophy. And this was, again, certainly not stated with so much force and emphasis in the 20th century by most philosophers as it was by Patočka. And I could add, this is one of the things that's so fascinating about Derrida's reading of Patočka is Patočka has been read by many Czech specialists as a kind of primarily or exclusively phenomenological and kind of secularist thinker, which I diverge from and Derrida diverges from. And he really says that Patočka is someone who sees, I mean, I'm actually quoting Derrida here. He calls Patočka one who follows the traces of a genius of Christianity that is the history of Europe. So Derrida kind of conflates the trajectory of the genius of Christianity and the history of Europe in a way that I think Patočka does as well.
So obviously Patočka deals with a whole host of religious topics and topics specific to Christianity even. I mean, you mentioned soul and metanoia. I know he talks about faith as well. And it sounds like maybe you would describe him as in some way a religious thinker or a thinker of kind of the Christian inheritance that Europe has received. But do you know kind of what his relationship with religion was? Was he a practicing, did he practice any kind of religion, or was he just a philosopher who was very interested in these questions?
My understanding, and I've spoken to some people who knew him personally, my understanding is that he was not himself religious, which in a certain sort of way makes it all the more interesting that he insisted so strongly on the Christian legacy, because, of course, it was extremely damaging to one's career and one's family at this period in the Eastern Bloc to be observant, to be devout, to attend church and publicly profess. And he, for a variety of reasons, in a sense, suffered a lot of the setbacks he would have suffered as a Christian, but he suffered them as a philosopher who spoke a great deal about Christianity. But as I'm sure you well know, there are many cases of 20th century philosophers, and not only 20th century philosophers, whose connection to faith is very hard to discern. I mean, there's a huge literature on Heidegger and Catholicism and Derrida and Judaism, and Wittgenstein and both Judaism and Christianity. So I think often these questions are hard to tease out, but it seems that Patočka was not a practicing Christian and not someone who would describe himself as a believer, but one who nevertheless believed that Christianity had something absolutely essential to offer to thought, and specifically to European thought.
Sure. Okay. So for folks who are maybe new to reading Patočka, haven't read anything of his, where would you say would be a good place for them to start?
I mean, personally, I think the publication I've already mentioned, the Stanford edition of Plato and Europe, is really the best place to begin. It's a beautiful, beautiful book in which he offers really quite original interpretations of the Greeks, not only Greek philosophy, but Greek myth, and then begins to sketch out how the Greek legacy relates to the kind of Christian formation of Europe that we've been discussing a bit, and also how both legacies, the Greek and the Christian legacy, can inform the phenomenological tradition within which he works. And one of the really remarkable things about Plato and Europe is that this is where he kind of sets out in a historical way, through a set of readings of texts, he sets out his theme of care for the soul. This is what he believes that Greco-Roman philosophy ultimately consisted in, care for the soul, and he believes that Christianity kind of modulates this in a number of interesting and fruitful ways. Christianity, too, is a form of care for the soul. And so I think at the same time, this set of lectures introduces people to this great theme in Patočka of care for the soul, and also allows them to read really, canonical, fascinating texts in the history of philosophy in a new way. And as I've already said, not just the history of philosophy. I mean, he has really extraordinary readings of the Oedipus myth, which of course is so important for, Freud and 20th century Western letters. And then it also allows them to begin to see why all of this, why these readings allow him to advance this new kind of theory of the history of Europe, which he says is first and foremost a history of the soul. And he himself says, look, I realize this is kind of a crazy idea that some sort of philosophical therapy, which gets picked up by the monasteries, is really at the heart of a civilization which leads to massive colonial expansion and to this tremendous conflagration in the middle of the 20th century, this 30-year catastrophe. But nevertheless, he says that's what I think is behind it all, but not behind it all in the sense that the Platonic Christian tradition is what leads to the catastrophe. Quite the contrary. He argues that Europe sort of began to deviate and to defect from the legacy already in the early modern period. So he kind of attributes a lot of the kind of global expansion of Europe, leading to a number of kind of tragedies and abuses I think we'll all know about. And certainly he attributes the two world wars, which, according to him, put an end to classical Europe, to the rejection of the Platonic Christian legacy, not at all to the perpetuation of it. So I think it's really an amazing book. It's a great place to begin.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'm very excited for us to hear from you more about kind of this, kind of heritage that Europe receives, especially from, as you said, kind of Platonism and Christianity and so forth. But before we get into that, I want to kind of talk about this idea of Patočka as a dissident, because it seems like at least in Western scholarship, that he's perhaps known just as much as a dissident as he is a philosopher, or perhaps at least as a phenomenologist. So would you say this descriptor of dissident is accurate? And then if it is, what would you say exactly makes him a dissident?
Well, I certainly think it's accurate. I mean, I use that in my Budapest lectures on Patočka. But I think it also needs to be nuanced. So he is not a dissident in the sense that his political engagement was almost exclusively negative until the very end of his life. So it was not his kind of public and vocal objection to the Nazi or the communist regimes which made him non grata. It was simply his refusal to participate. So in a sense, he was not a kind of active or activist dissident. He adopted a far more kind of, I wouldn't call it quietist, I think he himself would call it Socratic form of dissidence, that it wasn't public opposition to the regime, it was simply insisting upon his own private integrity and living his philosophical life that constituted his resistance. And then, of course, this changes in the 70s, and he concedes the necessity of actually voicing his concerns, which leads to him becoming the spokesman for the Charter 77 movement I've already mentioned. But I think in a nuanced way, he's a dissident from the beginning, and he willingly suffered the consequences of his refusal to participate in the party life of the party state of first Nazi-occupied and then communist-occupied Prague. So he could have been rehabilitated if he had made certain very obvious steps. And even though, as I've already said, it seems that basically being a professor was the great desire of his life, he nevertheless was willing to see that smashed and foreclosed, rather than make those concessions. Mm-hmm. Can I say one little point is quite interesting, because he makes a lot of the daimonion of Socrates. And he says, the daimonion of Socrates, as I'm sure you know, and your listeners know, never told Socrates what to do. It only ever told Socrates what not to do. And so it was a kind of negative form of guidance rather than a positive. And Patočka really claims this and kind of differentiates himself from, Marx famously said, philosophers have interpreted the world and now it's time for us to change it. And Patočka says quite the opposite. No, the task of the philosopher is not to change the world. The task of the philosopher is still first and foremost, with dignity, to say no to things that a very rapidly changing world is doing and wants to do and probably will do. But nevertheless, you follow the kind of negative guidance of the divine, of the daimonion, and you simply say, the world, the regime, so on and so forth, can do what it will, but I am not going to be a part of it. And he really, in a weird sort of way, he sets out this negative posture as the positive commitment of philosophy. And he himself links this up with the life and death of Jesus, which was, as you mentioned, the theme of my last book. And so he himself sees Jesus not as a kind of positive political revolutionary, but rather as someone who also makes his indelible mark on world history, human history, not so much, at least politically, not from what he says yes to, but from what he says no to, what we will not do. And so I think, at least in Patočka's own mind, he would like to be seen as this kind of special kind of dissident, one who suffers death in the end at the hands of the state, not because he's a militant, not because he's an agitator, but rather because he's a quietly but absolutely inflexibly principled person who doesn't deviate from what they believe they're called to do.
Sure. Okay, I want to move into some of your own work on Patočka. So you participated in a series of lectures, which you alluded to already, on Patočka, which took place at the Danube Institute in Budapest in 2021. And you were kind enough to send me some of your lectures from that series. So in your first lecture for that series, you spoke about the idea of Europe in Patočka's thinking, and especially kind of the many folds of intellectual inheritance, which for Patočka kind of together contribute to Europe as an idea. So you speak, for instance, to his treatment of Europe's inheritance of ancient Greece, the Roman Empire, but also ancient and medieval Christianity. So how would you describe sort of Patočka's understanding of the ways that these historical forces have contributed to what he calls the idea of Europe?
So, Patočka really has an extremely complex account of the history of Europe. And one of the things I like about his reading is that even though he insists on this kind of mystical, metaphysical, spiritual register, that at the heart of everything lies not a kind of scientific account of objective conflicts, class conflict, religious conflict, what have you, but rather the kind of destiny of the soul and the question of the free decision of the soul and the soul's quest for truth. So even though he has this kind of mystical theory of history, nevertheless, I have found him to be a really rather hard-headed historian of the kind of great blocks and great conflicts which shape European history, culminating, as I've already said, in the two world wars, which he really reads as a single continental conflict, global and continental conflict. But one of the other great conflicts, which is extremely important for him, is in fact the Crusades. And so one way of kind of construing his idea of the history of Europe, which he himself attributes to an early work by Hegel. Hegel argues that Europe was in many ways a kind of a cultic and a cultural unity, but not a convincing political unity before the Crusades, at least after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So this is Hegel's argument, which Patočka takes up and basically says that on the political level, the idea of Europe is really born in the Crusades. And there is a huge amount that we could say about that, but I'll just kind of set that out there. So it's a kind of, not late medieval, but kind of high medieval starting point for him in the 11th and 12th centuries. And then he really attaches a surprising amount of importance to the formal dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire, which only occurred in the early 19th century. This makes actually more sense when we remember, as of course we've not forgotten, that he was a Central European, and the Holy Roman Empire was basically a kind of, at least for much of its history, a Central European political constellation. So in a sense, you could say kind of from the millennial year of 1000 to roughly the early 19th century, 1800, Napoleon is where he sees a meaningfully unified European history unfolding. Of course, he's very well attuned to the fact that the Reformation introduces a huge rupture, and he's very well attuned to the fact that the discovery of the New World and intensified trade / colonialism in other parts of the Old World kind of coincided in the early modern period, and so both the religious division of Europe and the opening of Europe onto the globe had massive effects, which he talks a fair bit about. But let's just say, roughly speaking, the year 1100 to 1800 is kind of his unified European period. But before this, I mean, he attaches huge significance to what we might call the ecclesiastical unity of Europe in the early Middle Ages. And so he really sees, which a lot of other historians do too, including Michel Foucault, whom I've already mentioned, but he really sees the monasteries as the true heirs of Greco-Roman philosophy. So he sees the monasteries as the place in which, even in the absence of continent-wide political unity, this concern for the soul, cultivation of the soul, and preservation of the textual legacy of the Greek and Roman worlds was taking place. So there are different levels on which I guess the European idea unfolds for him.
Sure. No, thank you for all the texture you provided there. So getting kind of to what Patočka has in mind when he talks about the idea of Europe, or sort of, I guess you could say, the spiritual unity of Europe or something like this. What exactly does he mean when he talks about Europe as an entity in this sort of way?
So he offers actually a number of rather precise formulations, but all of them, nevertheless, I think would leave a lot of people dissatisfied, because ultimately it seems that what he's referring to is basically something like the unity of the Catholic Church, which of course has been lost. But he basically says that Europe had and lost a conception of its own unity, which was not founded in force. It was founded in something higher and purer than force. And this higher and purer ideal was actually something which was capable of limiting the deployment of force. And so he would see Napoleon and Hitler on some sort of continuum, and the Russians, the kind of Soviet seizure of the eastern half of Europe on some sort of continuum. All of these are attempts to provide a political unity to Europe simply on the level of kind of military and political control, direct control. And so he seems to have seen a far more kind of nuanced and more highly articulated kind of form of unity when in the earlier centuries, when the church and many, many states sort of collaborated in immensely complicated ways to hold together this sphere we sometimes call Christendom, even in the absence of any sort of unified secular authority, which, strangely enough, of course, after Patočka's death, the EU has kind of emerged as a increasingly unified secular authority for the continent. And it is one that we can all agree, whether we always are partial to the particular expressions of value that the EU wields and holds very close to itself. Nevertheless, we can say, like, the EU is actually a project of values in many respects. So it is actually interesting to speculate how Patočka would have positioned himself relative to the EU had he lived to see it. And I tend to think that he would have been actually very, very keen on some of the founding figures of the EU who were very Christian democratic in their outlook and their inspiration. Many of them were quite devout Catholics. And I think he would have been thrilled at the early moves to create what has become the EU. I'm not very confident he'd be happy with where the EU is today.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, in regards to Europe, one of the claims Patočka makes in his heretical essays in the philosophy of history is that Europe has in some sense kind of ended in the 19th and 20th centuries, or that it's kind of ended in the 19th century, and in the 20th we've kind of seen the fallout of this ending, or at least that Europe has kind of undergone, right, kind of some sort of fairly serious deformation of its identity, especially its spiritual identity. So in what ways does Patočka see these centuries, the 19th and 20th centuries, as kind of drawing Europe to some kind of a close?
So, I mean, as I've already said, he has really interesting readings, not only of kind of the spiritual struggles, but of the political struggles in the 19th and 20th centuries, which I think are interesting to read with the decades of distance we now have. Yeah, so I think in Patočka's heretical essays in the philosophy of history, which he wrote right about the same time as Plato and Europe, he sets out some really interesting readings, both of the political history and the spiritual history of Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries. And one of the many interesting aspects of his readings is that in both centuries, he really looks at the fact that it is the spiritual heirs of Europe, more than Europe, which actually begins to determine the destiny of the European continent. Now, the two heirs he looks at are Russia and the United States. And of course, this has a rather contemporary ring to it, which I think he would have not found at all surprising. So the kind of structure Patočka sets up already in the 1800s, and of course he's writing this more or less under Russian occupation, Soviet occupation in the 1970s. That might have influenced the way, the prominence he gives to Russia in 19th century European history, but nevertheless, I think there's a lot of material to back it up. So basically, he says that in the 19th century, Russia was already in many ways Europeanized. This is a process which begins quite clearly in the 18th century. So Catherine the Great and Peter the Great. So Russia is already in many ways Europeanized and Europeanizing, and yet it's significantly, as an Orthodox nation and empire, it is significantly more conservative or reactionary, in fact, than continental Europe. And so it was Russia, for instance, many more things could be brought forward, but it was Russia that came to the aid of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the middle of the 19th century, when there were a host of kind of popular uprisings against various powers, including the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So Russia was in Budapest, where I'm now speaking to you from, in 1848, 1849, at the behest of the Austro-Hungarian Empire as a kind of conservative or reactionary presence in Europe. So on the one hand, you have Russia, Orthodox nation, empire. And on the other hand, Patočka sees the United States as representing a sort of progressive offshoot and heir of the European legacy. And the United States exerting increasing force, I mean, in European affairs in the 19th century. Arguably, there was some influence already at the end of the 18th century in the period of the French Revolution. But he sees the kind of Anglo-American connection firming up in the 19th century. And so some of the settlement of the Napoleonic War, where basically you have parts, the kind of eastern parts of Europe looking to Russia, looking a bit more reactionary, looking to the east, and the other parts, the more western parts of Europe, closer to the UK, more maritime, more commercial, and thus in some ways more looking to the United States. He sees this basic picture in the 19th century as kind of reproducing itself in the 20th century in the Cold War, where there's a kind of formal division of the two Europes, one under the sway of the of Russia, and one more or less under the protection, one could at least say, of the United States. Of course, he is very attuned to the fact that there's a certain kind of reversal in the 20th century. Namely, it is at least arguably the case that during the Cold War, it is arguably the case that the Soviet Union was the kind of radically progressive heir of Europe, and the United States was a kind of defender of Christian civilization, Judeo-Christian civilization. But nevertheless, I'm not sure the picture was always quite that simple. And I think even in the 1970s in Czechoslovakia, Patočka was attuned to kind of the radicalism of the West and the United States, which has become a bit more palpable and visible in the 21st century, the early 21st century. I'm not sure he would have been entirely surprised by some of the sort of energy and force of progressivism in the United States and in the West after the end of the Cold War. So I hope that's not too convoluted, but the basic point I'm making is that he sees the kind of late modern destiny of Europe, so 1800s to late 1900s, as really being heavily influenced in a variety of ways by these two heirs of the European legacy, one Russia, which becomes the Soviet Union, and one the United States.
Sure. Yeah, I'm gonna jump questions actually. So I'm gonna hop over the question on questioning and mystery, which we'll come back to, because I think that the following question dovetails nicely with your response to the one we just discussed. So in one of your lectures at the Danube Institute, you speak to the fact that a handful of philosophers, so you already mentioned Derrida, but also Paul Ricoeur, and others have expressed a lot of concern over Patočka's final, I think it's his sixth essay in his Heretical essays, with what they see, what could be interpreted as kind of a glorification of the World War I battlefront. So in that lecture of yours, you claim that though, that Derrida, Ricoeur, and the other interpreters who interpret it in this way, that they have in some way kind of fundamentally misread Patočka, or not read that sixth essay within the context of his heretical essays in their entirety. So what in your mind is kind of the nature of this misreading, and what's maybe the alternative that you would propose for how we could read Patočka's heretical essays?
Yeah, so what happens in the sixth essay is that Patočka interprets, so I've kind of been discussing the 19th century wars, the Napoleonic Wars and various revolutions. And Patočka in the sixth essay interprets the entirety of the 20th century as war. So for him, what is most striking about living in Europe in the 1970s is the fact that even after the Second World War, so after these two truly unprecedented, cataclysmic wars, catastrophic wars on a global scale, that there was not peace. So he's really struck by the fact that the Cold War is a war, and that the Second World War did not end in peace. So he really takes war, let's say, very, very seriously, which again, I mean, I think reading Patočka in the early 21st century, when Plato and Europe came out, might have, his preoccupation with war and conflict might have seemed very distant and rather odd and strange. But of course, from our position now, sadly, war is all too present again, and even in Europe. Okay, so what I think the mistake to my mind lies in the fact that a number of interpreters have seen some statements that Patočka makes at the end of his essays. As you've already mentioned, they take these statements to be glorifying war, when in fact I think they can be read as simply indicating as a phenomenon. He is a phenomenologist, as we've already established, indicating as a phenomenon that the very extremity of kind of the extremity of the experiences that war subjects people to opens a distinctive set of possibilities for them. So he's not at all in favor of placing people in these extreme situations. I regard him as a philosopher of peace. He very much wants Europe to be at peace. He wants the world to be at peace. But nevertheless, he says, look, there's a reason why people as significant as Teilhard de Chardin, who was himself a pacifist and a very, very devout Catholic, and Ernst Jünger, who was quite a militarist, both of whom fought in World War I, nevertheless agreed that something really extraordinary presented itself as a possibility at the front line. And this extremity, of course, is constituted by the proximity to death. And it has some connection to the divine. So I think Patočka makes some rather startling statements about what war brings us face to face with, which various interpreters have seen as him sort of mystifying or glorifying conflict, when in fact I would say he's been preoccupied from the very beginning of his philosophy of history with the possibility of conversion. And what he sees at the front line is something very similar to what he describes in church, in fact. And I try to show this in my Budapest lectures, and I'll try to show this in my book on Patočka, that in church, if it's done right, you come face to face with your mortality. And you come face to face with your mortality in the company of others, all of whom you also recognize as mortal. And it is together with the others that you try to reckon with the fact that on the other side of death beckons God, lies God, however we want to put it. And so I actually think that he's trying to kind of see war as a tragic and immensely destructive and fundamentally misguided kind of actualization of kind of certain missteps taken in European history. But nevertheless, he believes that because it puts us face to face with death, this catastrophe at least opens the possibility of adopting an enlightened, a converted attitude, not only towards my own death, which I'm facing at the front, but also to the life and death of those I'm fighting, who, just as our fellow congregants in a church are facing their own mortality and thus are somehow close to the divine, so too the enemy across the trench is facing his mortality. And he, according to Patočka, he is a kind of fellow participant in this extreme drama, this extreme historical conflict, which brings us face to face with and kind of leaves us in the face of the ultimate. And so it's at the very end of his heretical essays where Patočka, far from like kind of stoking nationalist or partisan hatreds or animosities or anything like this, it's at the very end of the sixth essay where he says, it's at the front line where you can begin to understand that abyssal command to love your enemy. So this is one of the very, very few parts in the heretical essays, or to my knowledge, in the corpus of Patočka's writings where he directly quotes the Gospels. And of course, I don't think anyone could really construe love of enemy as a kind of martial injunction. So I hope that's some indication of why I think the basic mistake is that he's not glorifying, he's simply exploring what he takes to be a genuine phenomenon, which is there is something revelatory about war. And I've actually, on my podcast in Budapest, I've spoken to a number of people who have experienced war, and all of them seem to kind of confirm this. It's a tragic and it's an awful, but there is a kind of positivity to war, which has to be reckoned with and faced in some way. I think that's what Patočka is doing. But then he's also, in a sense, trying to point to something beyond conflict, which gets back to what I was saying earlier, that Europe has to have some sort of unity which does not rely on force or the clash of forces, which is what war is. And he's trying to point beyond these terrible conflicts, which shaped us in the middle of the 20th century, to a higher ideal, which I think is quite remarkable that he turns to the gospel, the Sermon on the Mount, in order to find that ideal.
Absolutely. Okay, I mean, as we're already sort of moving into what we might call kind of a mysticism around death, kind of a proximity to death experience at the front line, let's, for our last question, move kind of even further into sort of the mystical element of Patočka's thinking, or at least his kind of spiritual reading of history. So I know he's fond of things like questioning and mystery, which he speaks about explicitly. So what role do these ideas, questioning and mystery, play in his philosophy of history?
So he, I would say it's absolutely decisive. I mean, there's a really beautiful line in one of the heretical essays where he says that in Platonic philosophy, mystery has the last word. And this is, I think, correct to begin with. I think this is a correct reading of Plato. And he very much sees Christianity as an heir to this kind of posture and this recognition. And there again, I would agree with him that in Christianity, mystery has the last word. And okay, but then the question becomes, why is it so important for him? And I mean, there are huge essays that he's written, which are kind of revolving around this question, and then some of my own work on him does as well, but I'll try to be brief. So he believes that basically philosophy begins, care of the soul begins, ironically, care of that which is most our own and kind of most singular and subjective begins precisely when we ask the question, what is the world? What is the whole? What is topan, the all? Because ultimately, every meaning can only be established in relation to the meaning of all that is. And of course, if God is the source of all that is, which is the beginning of the Apostles' Creed and so on and so forth, Bereshit, then ultimately even all that is, the meaning of all that is, can only be derived in relation to that which creates, that which creates and sustains all that is. Anyway, but Patočka begins with this basic fundamental assertion that the question of the meaning of the whole is the source of the care of the soul. And he is perfectly aware that the question of the meaning of the whole can never be settled. But he also argues very, very forcefully in his heretical essays, which I find fascinating. He uses a forgotten German philosopher, Wilhelm Weichedel, to argue that physical survival as a human being in the face of total meaninglessness is impossible. Like he actually argues that the sensation, the perception of total meaningless will lead to death, full stop. And it's actually, that's in his third essay, and it's a very interesting argument. So he basically believes we must have meaning in order to survive, much less to create a kind of beautiful society or a civilization or an enduring cultural order. We must have meaning, and yet he believes that both philosophy and Christianity begin with the recognition that the ultimate meaning we seek can never be cognized, it can never be attained. And I'm sure your listeners know very well that, I mean, there's a hugely rich Christian tradition, negative theology, so on and so forth, that can kind of chime with this approach to Platonism. And he sees mystery as a kind of a phenomenon within which both meaning and meaninglessness can oscillate. And one can kind of recognize the impossibility of the final visio, the final vision, the final apprehension of what we so desire and so need. And nevertheless, within mystery, even the kind of pole of meaninglessness is held within a faith and a hope that the truth of the whole is there. Yeah, so I mean, I think basically for Patočka, care of the soul begins with questioning, and it's questioning which reveals both our kind of freedom, our ability to rise above and to set ourselves beyond the kind of pure conditioning of social and material forces, which would be a kind of more standard modern Marxist and other progressive theories of history. So it's questioning which reveals our freedom, and it's also questioning which reveals a kind of an essential and fundamental desire for what actually is, what is true, and our capacity to kind of seek it. So everything begins for him with questioning, but mystery is kind of the conceptual space which is opened up by a questioning which recognizes that it can never come to an end, precisely because it is ultimately concerned with all that is. And for many Platonic philosophers and all Christian philosophers, this questioning is also concerned with God, or first and foremost concerned with God. So I think basically one could say that questioning is the beginning of history for Patočka, precisely because it reveals human freedom and our desire for truth. And as I've already said, mystery is the end. Mystery has the last word, because it is within mystery that we can experience meaninglessness, which he explores phenomenologically, without succumbing to kind of the total desperation of one who has lost the hope of a higher meaning.
Sure. All right. Well, as we kind of come to a close here, I want to give you a chance to share what's next for you professionally. So do you have any kind of projects in the works, anything that you would like to plug here?
Well, I've got quite a few books kind of on the simmer, but certainly I think it's a very kind offer. Yeah, I mean, I've got a book under contract titled "After the Catastrophe" on Patočka and the Future of Europe, in which I'll really kind of try to introduce readers to his work and argue that the two texts we've been discussing, Plato and Europe and Heretical Essays, are really most interesting when they're read together. And so I'll kind of present a unified reading of both of those. Should be out sometime next year, I think.
Okay, awesome. Sounds delightful. I'll be very excited to Very excited to read it myself, hopefully. Okay, so for our listeners, where can they find you online or just learn more about your work?
Oh, well, I have a kind of second-rate Twitter account, Dusenbury David. I certainly welcome anyone and everyone to check it out. And then I also have a webpage, dldusenbury.com, where I'd be happy to answer any questions if your listeners have them.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, David, for your time and for your thoughtfulness. I've really enjoyed our conversation today. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much.